Hi everyone, welcome to today's discussion on account hierarchy. I'm Catherine Holt, the marketing manager at Fullcast.io, and today I'm here with Bernard Nguyen from Auth0 and Bala Balabaskaran. I work for him and I can never say his name right, from Fullcast.io, and they both have extensive experience in managing complex account hierarchies, and today they're going to facilitate our discussion. So before we start, just some quick housekeeping. So I will be sending out a recording today of this webinar, so you'll have a link to that in your inbox tomorrow. And we're going to start out today with a Q&A between Bala and Bernard. And Bernard will be talking about his experience both at Auth0 and also Zillow. And then about halfway through, Bernard will hop off and we'll turn the Q&A over to you guys. So we'll be taking questions in the Q&A box, as well as any comments or thoughts that you want to send. So you can do Q&A through the Q&A chat, and then any comments can be sent through chat. And I also have the ability to allow you to speak live. So if you're interested in speaking at any point, just send me that message in the chat and I can turn on your microphone. And a lot of people have already sent in some questions, so we do have some questions prepared to get us started, but definitely add in more thoughts throughout the webinar. So if that makes sense to everyone, I will pass us over to today's panelists, and I'll have Bala and Bernard introduce themselves. Bala, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Bala Balabaskaran, co-founder and CTO of Fullcast.io, and my experience dealing with account hierarchies goes back a few companies. Here at Fullcast.io, we built specific products to address that problem, but I've sort of worked with this problem in the trenches at Salesforce and at Microsoft before that. So we have quite a lot of war stories dealing with account hierarchies and how that's useful to the sales organizations that I'm hoping that we will be able to share with you today. And with that, Bernard, would you like to introduce yourself? We're so happy to have you on this panel.
Hey, thank you so much, and good morning to everybody on the call. My name is Bernard Nguyen. I've been at Auth0 for just a couple of short months. I'm Director of Sales Operations here at Auth0. And prior to Auth0, I spent most of my time last 7 years actually, at Zillow Group, where I led enterprise sales strategy and operations over there.
Excellent. So let's dive right into today's discussion. I thought we would get our juices flowing by trying to answer a few questions around the fundamentals of account hierarchy. And so let's start with these questions for Bernard, and I'll share my thoughts as well. So Bernard, what is account hierarchy, and what do you try to capture from a sales team perspective, from a sales ops perspective in an account hierarchy? What is it?
Sure. I guess a preface to start is I won't profess to be the absolute professional or the master, the guru behind Salesforce account objects and account hierarchies, but I'm happy to share my experiences in terms of how I've used account hierarchies in the past to make our sales team and our revenue teams a lot more efficient, a lot more powerful in terms of how they view going after accounts and supporting those accounts. And so if you think about the idea of hierarchies, you typically have various levels of accounts or various levels of objects. So for our purposes, let's say, for example, I am a beverage maker, I sell sodas, and I want to sell into retailers. And so you can think about accounts as a retail outfit in, let's say, Seattle, Washington, as one particular retail brick and mortar store, right? Going down the street, I've got another brick and mortar store and another brick and mortar store, all within the same brand. And so what account hierarchies allowed me to do is I could say that these three brick and mortar stores roll up to this particular store brand in Washington State, and then that rolls up to this particular store brand in the United States. So from a reporting perspective, from an account territory perspective, or from an account ownership perspective, there's a lot of different things I could do with account hierarchies where I say that these reps own these stores, this particular rep owns Washington State or the Pacific Northwest Territory, and then we have an overall account owner who owns that particular brand in the United States.
Makes sense. And now, I think the other second part of that question is what kind of relationships are captured? And basically here, we typically think about the ownership, of a parent account and its subsidiary as the quintessential account relationships. But it gets interesting, and I think this was one of the discussions that we were having earlier about your work at Zillow, where there's notions of agencies and franchises and things like that, which are interesting from a sales perspective in terms of how you sell. So how did you think about that problem at Zillow? We can start with some of the examples at Zillow and perhaps some other examples that you have on different kinds of relationships besides just the legal ownership relationship.
You're 100% spot on. I think real estate is a really great example because you've got agents who are typically real estate agents who are typically 1099s or independent contractors who then work for an office, and that office could typically be owned by a franchisor or franchisee, and they roll up to that particular brand, and that brand rolls up to an umbrella corporation. And so you don't just necessarily capture the direct owner and their subsidiaries. You also capture a lot of tangential relationships as well, and account ownerships and the various tags on those accounts can help us set up those relationships to give you a better view of who's who and who's what's what.
Right. And a couple of the other examples that I've encountered are franchises. So, from a selling perspective, do you sell to the headquarters of McDonald's or do you sell to every store? Now, this really depends on what you're selling, to be honest, because if you're selling HVACs, then you need to know all the locations, store locations, and you'll go sell directly to each individual site. But if you're selling IT technology, you probably want to sell to the headquarters, right? Or sell to the IT buying centers at McDonald's. So the franchise relationships are interesting. They tend to operate as independent businesses, but they have relationships that drive your selling behavior with them. The others that I've encountered are branding agencies, right? So even though, for instance, the brand may be owned by a particular company, all of the spend associated with that brand would likely be handled by an agency of some kind, a marketing agency of some kind. So there's that relationships that are associated with the accounts. Government is another scenario. Typically the roll-ups that are provided by a DMV or somebody like that provides hierarchy information may not necessarily reflect how you sell into it. And I've seen most companies sort of break up government organizations into local, federal, and state, and do sort of custom structures in terms of how they sell into it. So just a quick point around that, this whole topic is that account hierarchy is not just about who owns 51% of a particular subsidiary or who's the branch that reports into the regional headquarters, but it could also be about these kinds of relationships that are important when you're selling into the organization. So the follow-on question to that is, when do you have to worry about this as a sales organization? Do you need to think about this day one, or is this something that you can wait a little while, or when you start selling into enterprises? What is the typical sort of thought process there?
I think it largely depends on the makeup of the company and the mission of the company, right? You might have different products, you might have different services that are sold by a number of different sales reps and sales professionals who are tasked with selling a certain subset of product to a specific clientele. And so to answer your question more directly, the beauty of all of this is that in my eyes, the use of account hierarchies is hugely beneficial because of how modular everything can be. So let's suppose, using the real estate example, let's suppose that I'm selling a product at the office level. And let's say a year down the road, my product team has shipped a new series of products that are more appropriate for the company level or the franchisor level. Then I can create a separate account hierarchy, tag that as a franchisor type account. And I can then apply a different sales motion and a different sales organization altogether to go after those accounts. And so It provides a lot of flexibility and versatility with regard to when and how you stand up different sales motions. And we can add a third motion, or a fourth motion, or a fifth motion, depending on how you want to set it up. I think one of your questions there is, when should we set this up, or when should we begin thinking about this? I think sitting down and just mapping out all of the different layers of prospects we want to go after, meaning offices versus franchisors versus brands versus companies, as long as we have a decent mapping of our target market, I think that's a really good starting point to determine whether we should have 1 layer or 3 layers or 7 layers.
All right. And just diving into that a little bit more, I think one of the mistakes that people make is when you import information from data providers. They sometimes have tagging on whether a particular account is a site, it's a headquarters, it's a buying center of some kind, or it's the ultimate parent, if you will, of all of the family of companies. It's important in my mind to kind of think through what level of detail do you actually need in your system, right? And if you're selling something that is important, like in the case of Zillow, if you're selling something to the individual real estate agent, then you would need their information in there. But if you're a technology company selling to the technology division, then you might not need all that information in your system. So I think that's an important sort of distinction to make, because more often than not, what I find is just sort of this blind imports of data, and a lot of the data providing companies make it easy for you to just dump stuff into Salesforce, and you end up with a lot of stuff that you don't need, a lot of accounts that you don't need. And it's important to kind of, in my mind, think through exactly what level of data do you need as it relates to companies and hierarchies before you start importing data into the system. Because once you import it in, you're dealing with that, you're dealing with data quality associated with that, and there's obviously a lot of challenges further down the line with having things that you don't need in the system. Good point. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we've talked a lot about account hierarchies, and we've talked a lot about when do we need it, but why do you need it? What are some of the use cases for why you've got to solve this problem, right? And why is this important? So just to kick stuff off there, what are the benefits of account hierarchies, and what would you use them for? What is the use cases from a sales perspective, from an ops perspective? Just share some examples there, Bernard.
Yeah, I'll take this question from 2 different angles. As I mentioned, I led enterprise sales strategy and operations at Zillow Group. So I'll give you an answer based on strategy, and I'll give you a different answer based on operations. Operationally, having these different layers of accounts allow me to select different motions or customize different motions based on the target for that particular account hierarchy. So whether I have sales reps who are selling to offices, I've got one motion there. Whether I have sales reps who are selling to company level C-suite, V-suite personnel or personalities, I've got a different motion there. So you can customize messaging, you can customize different integrations and different rules based on the account type that you've designated for that hierarchy. One example for us would be, we could take a look at Marketo integrations for email blasts. Suppose we were to email a series of CTOs or CEOs or CFOs of a particular real estate company, we can selectively say, give me all the contacts that are related and associate to the company level account status or the account hierarchy. So it allows us to give a lot more flexibility with regard to targeting, with regard to motions, with regard to automations, where we can selectively choose different contacts, different objects that are associated directly to that particular account hierarchy. From a strategy perspective, or an analytics perspective, this is pretty powerful, in my opinion, at least. At Zillow, we deal with a lot of real estate listings. And so I could basically do a lot of reporting that rolls up listings at various levels. I could say that these offices are sending us 100 listings per month. And I can roll that up to say, out of all these offices of these particular brands in the state of Washington, they're sending us a collective, aggregated, in composite, 300 listings per month. And then I can say all together nationally as that brand, they are currently sending us 8,000 listings nationally. And we can just keep rolling up and up and up, depending on how many layers you might have.
Right.
So from a strategy perspective and from an analytics reporting perspective, it is incredibly powerful.
Right. Now, when you think about segmentation and ultimately assignment of reps to a specific set of companies, how does account hierarchies play into that in terms of what kind of models have you seen there? Is it typically you have a large enterprise with a number of companies, subsidiaries under that, you would have a single rep work it, or would you break that apart? Like one example that we used to do at Salesforce is we used to break up private equity companies because the private equities didn't make decisions for the type of stuff that we sold at Salesforce. So can you talk us through some examples there? I'll share some after you do.
Sure. I like what you said about private equity in different industries. I'm going to stick with real estate because that's the example that we've been thematically just really focused on for this particular conversation. But let's suppose that I've got a team of reps who are tasked with selling into different companies instead of offices, instead of regions or what have you, but they're tasked with selling into companies. And so from that, I could basically select companies with X number of offices, with Y number of agents, with Z number of listings, and I can categorize that group as my enterprise, high value, high dollar named accounts category. And using a different subset of rules, I can apply a different segmentation or a different category of segmentation to that book. And we can apply different motions, different reps, different assignments, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think the example that I'd like to share is that of a multinational corporation, right? And typically in these kinds of situations, you take an example like a Vodafone or a Berkshire Hathaway or one of these large corporations. What tends to happen is that the coverage models gets very interesting in different countries. So for instance, if I were to use the example of Vodafone, you might have an enterprise or a global account manager that's covering the entire territory, which is all of Vodafone's subsidiaries and so on. But then when you get down to specific portions of Vodafone assets in APAC or in North America where it's light, you might actually have that be covered by local reps as part of their territory. So what's interesting is that we start to see this distinction between the relationships that you might capture in an account hierarchy and how coverage models are then managed on top of that, right? And it's important, I think, to separate those two concepts because more often than not, I see implementations where the hierarchy is defined by the coverage relationship, and that sort of restricts your ability from a reporting standpoint to then say, how much business am I doing with Vodafone, because you've just broken all of these things out independently. So I think that's an important concept to kind of make sure that you maintain as you're implementing account hierarchies, is this notion of the reporting structure and the relationships as being an independent aspect from how you cover those accounts. So you might have one rep covering the whole thing, you might have multiple reps, you might have multiple regions covering it, and so you want to implement that fidelity in terms of allowing the coverage strategy to be defined independent of the relationships between all of the accounts, right, which could impact your reporting. So that's something that I've seen trip up companies when you do that, and when you sort of conflate the two together, there tends to be issues there. Just in terms of sharing some of the other use cases that I've seen, primarily when we encounter today at Fullcast, when we encounter companies talking about account hierarchies, it's primarily they're sort of evolving into an enterprise level selling organization. So as they grow and scale, at some point it used to be the Wild West, and now you're starting to get more structure into how you're selling. A big part of what's driving that, I think, is account-based selling and account-based marketing, where now you really need to understand the relationships between entities and the contacts and what level and what role they play in the organization. And so that sort of forces companies to really think about how do I want to organize the set of accounts and how do I want to cover them and how do I want to market and sell to them. So that kind of is a genesis of one use case, which is very powerful these days. And if you don't get these relationships right, and then you put the 100-ton automation on top with Marketo or Eloqua to send out emails, you don't want to have the whole thing blow up in your face because the underlying structure is not right, right? And so I think that's one big use case that we see all the time. The other big use case is white space analysis, right? And it's obviously a lot easier to sell into companies that you've already sold into than to go try and find new ones. And I think the white space analysis, and this is something more relevant for the reps, is I want to be able to see what else is out there in the companies that we have relationships with, right? And being able to look at that and plot out a account strategy in terms of how you're going to sell into that organization. So that's another very powerful use case that that we've seen. There's a whole bunch of other sort of operational issues that we run into, and we can talk a little bit about that in the second half. But primarily dealing with mergers and acquisitions. So when companies get acquired, when companies get divested or sold off, how do you handle that, and when do you handle it? Right? Because you might have situations where there are multiple reps now involved in the two companies that are getting into some sort of an M&A relationship. And then the second aspect of that is the timing associated with it, right? So typically when these large M&A activities occur, there's an announcement that it's going to be done. The companies in most cases function as if they've merged, but the actual transaction is not complete yet, right? And so you have these kind of weird zones where the customer wants you to treat them as if they're part of the new company, but the data from the third-party data sources don't reflect the fact that the transaction has completed yet. So you also see all of these sort of practical issues that may arise from the constantly evolving nature of the account hierarchy. So it's not static. It's not, there's always all kinds of changes that are happening all the time. And one of the important questions to think about is, when do you tackle that? Do you tackle it in the middle of the fiscal year, or do you say, okay, no, we're not going to change coverage during the middle of the year, but we're going to change it at the beginning of next fiscal? How did you guys handle that at Zillow or at Auth0? How do you think about that problem?
How do we update accounts, or I guess relationships with respect to M&A opportunities?
Right. In terms of policy, right? Do you merge them when they're announced, or do you wait for that change at the end of the fiscal and then you kick it off for the next fiscal?
That's a tough question, just because we don't necessarily understand when these mergers and acquisitions will be completed. But I would say as soon as we have an inkling or an idea as to when things might happen, then that's a cue for me to go out there and do a lot of reporting to understand the potential impact in terms of my total addressable market. Is it shrinking? Is it growing? That's a signal for me to also do some reporting to understand whether my reps' territories or segmentation of those territories, those businesses, will be impacted as well. So there's a lot of preemptive action I can take to understand the impact of the M&A opportunity. But there's also, I don't mean to say impact in terms of being negative. I think there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of upside to say that if and when this M&A process or this M&A opportunity happens to get completed or goes through, then that could potentially open up some serious upside for the company, because maybe company B was highly engaged and company A was less engaged with my company. So there's a lot of different things we could do in terms of forecasting and sizing and understanding how this may impact our business, for better or for worse.
Makes sense. There's a couple of questions, but I want to start with the question from Christina. She's asking about what kind of sources of truth do you use for company hierarchies? Do you buy third-party data, or is this something that you handle manually? What's been your experience with this?
That's a tough one, just because the idea of source of truth is, at least from my experience, it's a dynamic concept, right? Things that are source of truth, things that are true today may not be true tomorrow. And so to handle the idea of understanding, let's say, how many offices does this real estate company have, we can do some quick Google searches, or we can buy a list to understand at a snapshot in time, this company had X number of offices. And so I will tag that somewhere in Salesforce, maybe at the parent level or the grandparent level. But I think it would behoove us to create a more dynamic level of reporting by understanding that, okay, today I think there are 10 offices in this company, but over the course of time, as we build more office type accounts in that hierarchy, I can update my analytics, or I can update my reporting to have the number of associated office accounts trump the originally imported data that we purchased from some third-party source.
Right.
So again, the idea of source of truth should be dynamic.
Right. No, I'll definitely concur and add to that. I think one of the interesting challenges that you face is if your segmentation is driven by, let's say, number of employees or annual revenue or number of offices or some idea like that, that is dynamic and volatile in nature, then this question of sort of source of truth is interesting, because what I find is that your reps probably have the most up-to-date information when they're talking to their customers compared to any data source that you could find. And my basic assumption with data sources is that they're at least 6 months old. And even the best ones are 6 months old. And so this notion of a source of truth, I think you're dealing with a hierarchy of different sources. And I would, if you can validate the rep information, if you can capture it and validate it as part of your ops process, I think that'll give you the most up-to-date information out of any source that's out there. But you definitely can't do that for all of the accounts, because the reps don't touch everything, right? So in that kind of situation, you probably want to look for an organization that and test out their data. Specifically for hierarchy information, DNB has been that standard. Now, even with DNB, you would look at sort of the U.S. market, and you'd look at sort of the enterprise and mid-market type accounts, and they tend to be more accurate. Not 100%, but more accurate, as I would put it. But when you get further down to smaller accounts, or even out to the international space, that data source tends to suffer, right? And based on their presence. And what we've done, and drawing from my experience at Salesforce and Microsoft, what we've done is we've actually purchased data in country, where we could get more accurate information than this either pan-European or pan-world kind of data sources like DNB, and augment it. So what you end up building then is this sort of for each kinds of information, like employee counts tend to be more accurate with certain data providers, and then with hierarchy information tends to be more accurate with other data providers. So I think you need to get to a scenario that works for you, but the key is allowing for your sales organization to have the flexibility to provide inputs into that process, right? Now, whether you do that on a quarterly basis, or whether you do that on a one-off basis, that's really up to your process and how much you can handle it. But I always find that that your sales reps, assuming they're not gaming the system, have the best information to provide to you. The other part of your question is do you purchase data from a third-party source? Absolutely. I think this is something that at scale is impossible to track on a one-on-one basis. So, buy a third-party data source that'll get you 85–90% of the way there, and you will have to tweak. The thing with data sources that you have to be careful about is that there is no silver bullet, right? There is not a single source that will give you all of the data you need. It'll get you most of the way there, and then you have to sort of customize, as we talked about, all these examples related to like private equity and franchises and Coca-Cola bottling plants and Toyota dealerships. And so those are really sort of your custom definitions of how you want those relationships to exist, which may not come from a third-party source, right? So you're going to get about 85% of the way there with the third-party source, and then you need to have for those high-touch accounts or for those accounts that require that level of thinking, you would need to have a manual process and incorporate the feedback from the sales team into that process. So hopefully that answers the question related to that. We have another, I want to be respectful of Bernard's time as well.
Yeah, it's just about 10:30 now. So Bernard, if you need to hop off, that's great. If you have any other final thoughts, feel free to share those.
And we'll dive into the questions right after that.
No, I want to thank everybody for your time, and this has been, at least in my eyes, very productive, and I learned a lot from Bala as well. So I would say one last note: account hierarchies may be difficult to implement to begin with. There may be some challenges with regard to understanding the level of hierarchies and how to tag various entities, but I think there's a lot of value and there's a lot of benefits and a lot of upside to implementing this process, just because from an analytics perspective and from an operational perspective, I think it affords you a lot of versatility and flexibility with regard to implementing a sales motion or a sales strategy for your business.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you for sharing your experience with us, Bernard. Appreciate that. I learned a lot from you from the discussions we've had so far. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bernard. So glad that we could have you on. So we're going to keep this open to answer more questions. And like I said at the beginning, if you have an answer to any of the questions that come in, or you want to share an example, just either chat me or even just put something in the Q&A, and I'll be able to unmute your microphone. So we did have a question that came in from Corey, so we can answer that live right now, or we can start in with the questions that were sent on ahead, which actually a lot of them kind of relate to Corey's question around third-party data sources. So
okay.
Maybe we want to start talking more about that, and then we can jump into some of these other questions that were sent in.
Absolutely. So let's start with Corey's question. Related to third-party data enrichment, which have you found to be the best SFDC account enrichment sources for legal entity? So who's the parent of who from a legal entity standpoint? The best for me, again, as I mentioned, is depends on the region, depends on the size of the accounts, but for the most part, Dun & Bradstreet tends to have a pretty good data set in terms of the legal hierarchies. Especially the way that they use their DUNS numbers. And if you're familiar with the DUNS numbers, these are numbers that are issued by Dun & Bradstreet, and it's used in a number of places, which forces it to be a little bit more accurate. And one of those things is that when a DUNS number is issued, DNB does actually talk to somebody in the company before they issue a DUNS number. The hierarchy of relationships is represented in a series of DUNS numbers. And so it starts with a DUNS number, which is a unique ID for a particular entity at a specific location. And then it rolls up into a parent account or parent relationship. And then from there to a domestic parent, which is your country level headquarters, if you will, if you're starting to think about international companies, and then all the way up to an ultimate parent, which is sort of the international headquarters of a particular company. So they've done a pretty good job of capturing that and maintaining that, I think. So that to me is a pretty good data source to think about. And again, as I said, DNB data in APAC and Latin America tends to be not as accurate, but they've done some acquisitions in the recent years to shore up that information. So I think they're working on that problem. But definitely in the US, definitely in Western Europe, they tend to have pretty good relationship information. The other thing that is interesting when it relates to the legal entity standpoint is that we talked a little bit about M&A and how M&A is handled, and as you know, those transactions happen throughout the year. So how does that get reflected in the DNB data? It tends to take about 6 months. I find with the data to get updated. And so just keep that in mind, that there is a time lag between when the transactions complete and when the data source is able to reflect that information to you. So that's a couple of things to keep in mind there as you think about data sources. The other data sources that we've seen, Discover.org provides some level of data information, of hierarchy data, and Orb Intelligence is a new one that I've heard does that as well. So these sources may provide the hierarchy information, but for me, the gold standard, if you will, for certain regions is Dun & Bradstreet. And the other interesting thing to think about is DNB does have tagging on the different types of accounts that they hold, so branches, subsidiaries, and things of that nature. So along with the DUNS numbers, always consider that information, the site information as well, because I think that'd be useful for how you end up defining your hierarchy. Quick question from Corey related to DNB. Curious if you've seen that do a good job of matching to existing SFTC accounts, and do they match on domain, US state name, all, or what? So matching is an entirely different problem. And more often than not, the reason why third-party data sources don't work very well is if you can't match accounts to the information that they provide. Typically, DNB does 2 levels of matching. One is a pretty simple match where they use account name, address information, domain, and phone numbers, and a few fields like that to do a match. And then they do a more deeper match called heuristics match, and you can that tends to produce better results. But they also give you a score, a matching score of I think it's a scale of 0 to 10. Which shows you, how confident they are with the match that they've done. This is a perennial challenge because when you get account information or when you get accounts created in the system, typically coming out from a marketing web form or web to lead form that you have, you want the customer to fill in as little information as you can. And when you do that, you don't have enough information for the matching to successfully work. And so that's a common challenge. There are some solutions to sort of enriching it in the background to allow for these matching to with the third-party data sources to work better, but that's always a challenge. And domain names are great, you can use them. Unfortunately, domain names don't give you the fidelity of the hierarchy structure, so it doesn't distinguish between a domestic parent versus an international or an ultimate parent, or the different types of sites that may exist and so on. So I think the challenge there when you try to group accounts by domain name is that you miss that fidelity as you're doing that.
Great, awesome.
What about Datafox? I believe Datafox also provides hierarchy information, although I'm not deeply familiar with what their hierarchy information looks like. But I've heard that they provide that as well.
Cool.
All right, let's go back to the questions that we got earlier. Let's see. How are you identifying the decision maker in territory management? How do you define ownership based on buying pattern or location? So again, this goes back to some of the discussions that we've been talking about. And typically, when you're doing territory management, you're trying to segment based on the buying motion as much as possible, right? So you really are trying to define your sales motion based on how the customer buys. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, a public sector team tends to get created first, in most organizations that are looking to verticalize, because the buying pattern of public sector is very different from the commercial sector. And so that's really kind of what drives the decision making around territory management, is the buying model. And you'll find that depending on what you're selling, the buying centers for those may be different, right? So if you're selling IT related software or hardware or whatever the case may be, the buying centers may be the IT departments, which may be located in different places than what your legal hierarchy or your legal entities may dictate, right? So what I've seen done in these cases is to really try and create those custom hierarchies, as we talked about, and really reflect your buying pattern in the hierarchy data, so you can assign them to the appropriate territory owners. Like, for instance, you take a big company like Chase, their IT buying centers may be actually in Texas and California, not necessarily where the headquarters is. And so in that case, from a territory perspective, you want to give it to the rep that's covering Texas and California, as opposed to the rep that's covering New York, right? So again, you want to keep that in mind. From a territory perspective, you're trying to optimize the resources on your end to how the customer buys. And the customer data and the hierarchy data essentially should reflect that setup. And how do you define ownership based on buying patterns is the second part of the question. Again, as I talked about, try and match it to the buying behavior. We talked about an example earlier. If you're selling HVACs to every location of McDonald's, then that may be a different buying pattern than if you're selling IT to the headquarters, right? So that's an important aspect of sort of thinking about it. Private equities, we talked about it earlier. Private equities typically don't make buying decisions, but from a legal hierarchy perspective, companies roll up into them, right? And so in that case, as I said, at Salesforce, we used to break them so that we let the portfolio companies sort of stand on their own as separate hierarchies, as opposed to rolling up into a private equity, which may simply be 5 or 6 people, right? And so you really want to reflect the buying behavior in your territory management and ownership assignments. The other question we have is, how should we address contacts in the account hierarchy? For example, I've dealt with customers in the hotel industry, and purchases may happen at a few different levels, which is difficult when it comes to Service Cloud implementations. Wondering how others handle contacts to multiple account model if they're trying to manage case contact, email contact mapping within the CRM. So to be honest, I've seen this handled really badly. Typically what tends to happen is people create duplicate contacts at all levels within the hierarchy, and that creates all sorts of mess, and people don't really do a good job of dealing with this. Contacts are quite volatile. As you can imagine, when people change jobs and move, it's not really updated in your system all the time, and there aren't a lot of third-party data sources that will keep you updated on contact movement and changes there. So that it tends to be a pretty difficult problem. I think the approach to take here would be to keep the amount of data that you're putting into your Salesforce simple. So if you don't need a bunch of levels in the account hierarchy, don't create them in Salesforce, because every piece of data you put into Salesforce, you have to manage and administer and deal with data quality. So my thought here would be, if you were structuring your hierarchy in a way that reflects the buying pattern of the customer, then put the contacts where that buying occurs, and where the sales rep can actually then use the contact information in an effective way. I know that requires a bit of thought when you're adding contacts into the system, which typically doesn't happen because you're just importing contacts, or you're just adding them to the first account you can find in the lookup. But I think that extra step of kind of a thought process on where should this contact sit will will serve you better. But it is, it has to be handled with a little bit of policy, but it also has to be handled with enablement at the rep level. One of the concepts that's becoming very important as it relates to contacts and account-based management or account-based selling, account-based marketing, whatever you want to call it, is the role of the person within a company. So as you think about adding a contact into your system, force the thought process on what role does this person play. And this is captured within Salesforce in the contact account relationship objects, or even in the opportunity roles and things like that. But that role definition actually allows you to add more structure into where this context should sit, right? And you can then control whether the buying role or a budget owner or a procurement role, wherever those roles happen to be, are sitting in the right buckets. And you can run then reports and figure out, hey, wait a minute, why is a IT department decision maker sitting in a branch location somewhere here? That doesn't look right, right? So you can then add a little bit more data quality reports and cleanliness into the process if you're able to identify the role that a contact plays when you add them into the system. So think about that. I think that's more and more important as you put automation on top, especially you turn on mass emailing with Eloqua or Marketo on top of the CRM data. If you don't get that right, then that would be a problem. The other reason why it's important to pay attention to this is GDPR. If you put the contacts in the wrong places, then the rules that you may apply for GDPR, for instance, may be impacted by that. So for instance, if a contact is located in Europe, you have certain legal requirements for maintaining consent information and things like that associated with that contact, compared to a contact that's in North America or elsewhere where the conditions are a little bit lax from a privacy and a consent perspective. So now it's, with the regulations, it's more important to really understand where you're putting these contacts, how you're tagging them, and so that you can apply the appropriate legal GDPR requirements on top of it as well. And even within the US, California, with the new California law, it's important to understand people that are located in California versus outside. All right, hopefully that answers those questions. Is there a trusted source? I think we covered that from an earlier question. Is there an enrichment provider that's good with data hierarchy? I think we tackled that question quite a bit. All right, any more questions?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes if anyone wants to add more questions into our discussion. I did have kind of like this might be more sales management rather than pure sales ops, but something Christina asked that kind of prompted me to think is, she asked in her question about the dispute process if sales teams find discrepancies. So in your experience, or what you've seen other sales managers do, if someone has an ongoing deal with a company that then gets rolled into another company, what have you seen are best practices in managing that?
Typically, you in those kinds of scenarios, you want to give flexibility to the sales management to decide how to handle those. You might have a policy at the company level that says, we don't make M&A changes throughout the year, and we do that, or we do that every quarter, or whatever the case may be. But when you're in the battle, in the front of the battle, you really want to give the sales managers flexibility to kind of move the deal forward and not be encumbered by sales ops global policies, right? So you want to give them that flexibility to deal with it. How have I seen it done? There's a couple of ways that I've seen it done. One is that the sales manager decides who gets to pick the deal and work the deal. And that tends to be fraught with all kinds of issues if you're not careful. But the other way that I've seen it done is teaming, where the reps would team together to deal with the the relationships that they've built, for instance, in two companies that are merging, if they work together, the chances of them closing the deal are much higher than if one person is trying to discover the other side, right? So you don't want to lose that momentum in the field, and you want to enable the sales managers to kind of make those decisions. More often than not, what happens is some sort of a quota credit or some sort of a split commission model is negotiated, and that's how I've seen that happen, and really kind of being very strict about these things doesn't yield the right results when you want flexibility at the frontline level.
Awesome. Well, we have one last question about Dun & Bradstreet from Sherry. She wants to know how does their cost compare to others, and do you prefer that to others? Which I think you kind of answered before, but you may have some final thoughts.
I think I'm going to avoid the question on the cost because I think you'll have to talk to them specifically about what they can do for you. I think the cost specifically for hierarchy data, I don't think I'm familiar with it. Typically, when you're buying a data source, you're buying a whole bunch of information, which includes account hierarchy. So, and they do, do custom pricing for you if you're looking for specific pieces of information. So I would suggest contacting your D&B folks and doing a comparison with other data sources like DiscoverOrg and so on. As I said, D&B tends to be the data source with the most amount of sort of more accurate data, if you will, as it relates to hierarchy compared to other data sources that I've seen. I think there are others that are coming up. DiscoverOrg definitely is doing quite a lot of work in that space. But again, think about the region, the regions where certain data sources tend to be stronger. If you look at Japan, for instance, there are specific data sources in Japan that have much more accurate data than any global sort of data provider would have. And if you look at LATAM or APAC or India, the data sources there tends to be different. Local data sources can provide you with more information and more accurate information than these global or pan-European kind of data providers. So consider that in mind. For the US and Western Europe, D&B does a pretty good job.
Cool. And one last quick question from her as well. On split commissions, is there a tracking tool you've used for that?
We have typically captured that within Salesforce using opportunity splits. So that's a good way to capture it, and using account team and opportunity teams to capture the people that are working on the deal, or depending on your commissioning model, if you do a territory-based commissioning model or a engagement-based commissioning model, use the account team information to track that. Ultimately, you want to have some level of control on who gets tagged into an opportunity and all that good jazz, but that's what I've seen used. And you can then feed that information into an exactly or a calidus from a commission calculation standpoint.
Great. All right, well, we're coming up on time. If you have other questions, we'd of course love to answer them, especially if they're specific to your company. So I've included Bala's email here. That should be easy to remember, I hope, but I'll also include it in our follow-up email. And you're welcome to get in touch with all of us, both Bernard and myself and Bala on LinkedIn. And then you can also follow Fullcast on both LinkedIn and Twitter. We're doing a lot of work on account hierarchy right now, and then our next push will be on data, which is very closely related to account hierarchy. So if you'd like to learn more about that, go ahead and follow us, and then feel free to ask any questions you have to myself or to Bala. We're happy to talk more about what your company is going through and ways that we could help you. So thanks everyone for joining today. We're really happy to have such great questions and engagement, and we look forward to seeing you online again soon.